Are you overwhelmed with planning a trip to the South Island of New Zealand? Or are you simply curious what a trip to the South Island of New Zealand looks like? Well, this is what mine looked like. And I want to share some tips about the itinerary we chose, what I thought worked and what I thought maybe didn't work. Ultimately, we were able to do ours in 3 weeks, which I know is not super realistic for most people because my boyfriend and I do work on cruise ships. So when we're off contract, off the ships, then we have several weeks to even months off. But even if you do 1 or 2 weeks, then this will help you pick the highlights of what you really want to get into your trip and what you think is realistic for you. We actually started all the way from Auckland, which is at the top of the North Island. We chose to start from Auckland because that's where my partner is from. It honestly made the most sense and we just used his car. Before we did this South Island tour, we actually started with a North Island tour. So we did some mini trips across there down all the way to Wellington, where we took the ferry from Wellington to Picton to the South Island. When we decided we were going to do this trip, the planning aspect was so overwhelming. Even though my partner is literally from New Zealand. So we started off the planning process by sketching a map of New Zealand. We sketched out where we wanted to go, and then we tried to figure out the most effective way to get around. And there are actually several loops that you can do. But first, I'll give you an overview of our itinerary. First, we started from Auckland and then went all the way to Tauranga. Then we went to the Tongariro National Park and we did the Tongariro Crossing, which is a really famous hike. From Tongariro, we went all the way down to Wellington, and this was an amazing place to stay. It is the capital of New Zealand, even though Auckland is the biggest city in New Zealand. So early in the morning from Wellington, we took the Inter-Islander ferry down to Picton. From there, we immediately drove down to our Airbnb in Christchurch. We actually stayed there for 4 nights, but I recommend not staying there for that long. I'll get into that a bit later as well. Then we drove west to Arthur's Pass National Park. There's a lot of national parks here. And we just did a day trip there on the way down to Twizel, which was really embarrassing because I thought that it was pronounced Twizel. So just keep that in mind, Americans. We stayed there for 4 nights and it was so worth it. We were so glad that we stayed so long because there is so much to do in the national park. And if you're a hiker, which you probably are if you're going to the South Island, then you should definitely stay here. Then we drove down to the East Coast through Oamaru and then down to Dunedin, and we stayed in Dunedin for 2 nights, which is kind of like New Zealand's Scotland. Then we stayed in Queenstown for 3 nights, and then went up briefly to Wanaka for a couple nights, stayed with a friend there. It is very expensive to stay there, so you definitely want to book something in advance in Wanaka. Then the rest of it was sort of getting back to Auckland. So then we drove 6 hours up the west coast of the South Island, all the way up to Greymouth. We stayed there for 1 night only, and then we went up to Picton and stayed for 1 night again, and that was absolutely gorgeous, surprisingly. I wasn't really expecting much from Picton, but it was beautiful. And then from Picton in the morning, we took the Inter-Islander ferry up to Wellington again, and then from Wellington, we drove straight to Lake Taupo, and that was pretty much the end of the trip. Then we went up to Auckland again. We will never be the same after that trip. About the transportation, so yes, we did not rent a van, which is a very popular thing to do in the South Island. We just happened to have access to a car, so of course we took that route because the vans are extremely expensive. It was about 5,000 New Zealand dollars, which translates to, this is not accurate, but roughly 3,000 American dollars to rent the van for 3 weeks, which in retrospect is not that much, but it actually ended up being cheaper for us to get Airbnbs along the way and just take his car. But for most people who don't have access to a car here, then the van is definitely the way to go. So we drove along the coast down to Christchurch from Picton, and it was absolutely stunning. It was a little bit overcast, but we still got to see seals, and apparently there were penguins there and lots of wildlife to see, so we did get to stop along the way. Because we initially planned our trip to be 4 days in Christchurch, we kind of restructured it again after talking to some local people because they were really confused why we chose Christchurch to stay the longest amount of days in. And it was because we thought it would be a good base, but it actually is not that close to all the sites a little bit farther south that you want to see anyway. So Queenstown is usually the hot city to go to in the South Island, even though it's a lot smaller. It's very touristy though, so keep that in mind. But Christchurch, we did stay for 4 days and we used 1 or 2 days as admin days. We had to get some work done as well. I recommend hitting up Riverside. It's in the main city. There's so many street vendor style places, but it's indoors, so it's in this market. There's also a street art trail in Christchurch in the main city. And there's a lot of cool architecture as well there. They have a famous gondola ride and it gives you 360 views of the city and Littleton Harbor on the other side. It's gorgeous. You can actually do a little bit of a short hike or like a few different trails up there. We hit up the art museum there, the botanical gardens, New Regent Street. Then on the way out of Christchurch, we stopped west in Arthur's Pass National Park, and it was a little bit out of the way, so I don't know if it's totally worth your time, but it was really cool to see the Huratafiti rock formations. It's also translated to Castle Hill, and those rocks are actually limestone rocks that were apparently underwater many years ago. Then we continued on to Twizel, which was so epic. We spent 4 days there and we traveled 45 minutes between our Airbnb in Twizel to the Mount Cook National Park. On day one, we started off doing a pretty hard hike, Sealy Tarns track, because it wasn't that long, but it was really steep. It was literally just a staircase all the way up. But the one thing that was keeping me going is that you could see all the views as you were going up. So you weren't just going up this staircase in the woods. We weren't super lucky with the weather. It was raining on and off, but it was still absolutely gorgeous. And I definitely recommend doing this hike. When we were making our way back down, I realized that my hiking boots that were new for this trip were way too small for my feet, so I dealt with that the entire trip. It ended with blue and black toenails, so definitely make sure that your hiking boots are really high quality and that you break them in before you go on the trip, and you know if they're too small or not. Don't make my mistake, but I am a little bit silly. I tend to do things like that, so that might just be a personal thing. The second day we did a loop around Tasman Glacier Lake. We also did the Mercer Loop, which is just around the corner. All of the main hikes are starting from that same area, so that's really nice. Then we actually drove to Lake Tekapo. We did a mini short walk around there, saw some sheep, saw some sights, and then we went to the main town in Lake Tekapo. And actually stargazing here is really famous. We decided not to do it, but I definitely recommend putting this into your itinerary because it is apparently one of the best things to do in the South Island is stargazing at Lake Tekapo by a famous chapel that's there, which is historic to the town. So the last morning there, we got up super early because we saw on our weather app that we would have some sun coming out at 7 a.m. So we started the hike Hooker Valley, which is a very famous hike. It's actually really easy. It's pretty flat the whole way up. And also it tends to get very busy. So all the blogs that I did research on about this track said to go as early as you can so that you beat all of the people. It was truly an amazing hike, and the views you get truly make it feel like you had to hike for hours and hours to get there, but really, it didn't even take that long. Some people would say that's not a real hike, but trust me, it's good to have a balance on a trip like this. Then we had a coffee at the hotel nearby. There is a hotel in the national park. It's very pricey though, just a forewarning, and very touristy as well. The best places to stay are the campsite, Twizel, or Lake Tekapo if you want to be near the national park. One thing I will add about Mount Cook is that I wasn't expecting the weather to be as cold as it was. And yes, it was in November, which is the end of spring in New Zealand, and it's alpine weather, but everyone on Instagram made me think that I would be wearing a flowy skirt. I don't know if they were just really cold for the pictures they took, but I did hear after we had arrived that the best time is actually to go a little bit later, but it just worked for our schedule to go in November. Then we drove down to Dunedin. Dunedin was interesting, to say the least. Oamaru is a town that's right before Dunedin, so we stopped there, and it's this old Victorian era town, and it has these really old buildings, and it was actually first colonized by the French, so it has a lot of French themes there, and cafes and things like that, architecture, and they're still very embedded in the Victorian culture. So a lot of people do reenactments and they dress up in Victoria era clothing. Our first day in Dunedin, we actually checked into our Airbnb. It was a little bit colder and windier than I expected in Dunedin for late spring. We went to the steepest street in the world, Baldwin Street. You can't really tell in the pictures how steep it is, but it is pretty steep. The next morning, we went to Beam Me Up Bagels, which is a Star Wars themed bagel place, and it was delicious. We headed to the historic railway station. That was really beautiful on the outside. It wasn't very interesting on the inside, to be honest, but there was a farmer's market right around the corner. So we ended up just walking around there for a bit. and we hit up the Otago Museum, and my partner surprised me with tickets to a planetarium presentation, and that kind of made us have existential crises about the world and everything, but it was very interesting. And then we also went to a butterfly garden, which was one of the highlights. We wanted to pack in as much as possible in this full day that we had in Dunedin, so we actually drove out of the city to Larnach Castle, and they turned it into a spot with botanical gardens and a little gift shop. It did feel kind of like we were in Scotland. Then we still had one more excursion to do, so we went back to the Airbnb, just relaxed for a little bit, and then we drove back to Oamaru. We didn't actually realize that we needed to drive all the way back to Oamaru to do this blue penguin colony viewing. So you can view the blue penguins. They're very famous. They're a very small penguin. They're so adorable, and they migrate between New Zealand and Antarctica. So they were in New Zealand at this point in November, and you can actually sit down and view them doing their nightly routine. So they come from the ocean, and you watch them go onto the shore, and then they slowly but surely, in a very slow and scared, skittish way, go to their sleeping area. So they're actually protected, and you're not allowed to touch them or anything, and you're not allowed to take pictures. So I didn't take any pictures, but it was cool. It was just a little bit farther away than we thought. In the morning, our last stop was this cute cafe called Long Dog Cafe, and then we headed to Queenstown. So we were in Queenstown for 3 days, and the biggest thing we planned there was the helicopter ride, and we kind of splurged on that to go over the Milford Sound. That's in the Fiordland National Park. What we didn't factor into it was the potential for the weather forecast to ruin the helicopter ride, so we actually ended up not doing it, and we didn't want to do an alternative tour by bus because the bus from Queenstown to the viewing area is literally like 13 hours away, and we were just like, we don't want to be in the car for that long. We were already driving a lot. So if you want to view Milford Sound, it might be your best option, unless you know the weather's going to be immaculate. It might be your best option to go travel down closer to stay in the Fiordland National Park instead of going from Queenstown. Instead, we decided last minute to do the Ben Lomond Trail in Queenstown. It's a huge hike, and it has panoramic 360 views of the Alps and the lake, and it is just absolutely insane views. But we didn't listen to the reviews on All Trails that said that it was literally the hardest hike that they've ever done. No, we were like, oh no, we'll be fine, we'll be fine. It was literally the hardest hike I've ever done in my life, and I was not expecting that. Part of what made it the hardest hike I've ever done, we started hiking all the way from the parking lot at the bottom, but you can take the gondola up about a third of the way up the mountain, which makes it a lot better apparently, and I would definitely recommend doing that. We just didn't do it because the gondola was pretty expensive. It was like $60 US per person, so we were just like, no, we're on a budget, man. We walked all the way from the bottom. I now regret that. But honestly, it was also one of the best hikes I've ever done because the views are just completely unbeatable, and the video actually does not do it justice. The next day, we had a little bit of a chiller day. We went to Bob's Cove, and we were super sore, so we just sat by the water. It was a bit cold to swim at that point, I have to say. Our last morning, we checked out of the Airbnb, and we went down to the main town. And we had some time to kill because the road from Queenstown to Wanaka is supposed to be an hour or so, and it was 4 hours because of the one road that was having construction done on it. There was a detour that was 4 hours, so we ended up just kind of chilling and waiting around for a while until the road opened again. So just keep that in mind as well, that there's two options to drive, and sometimes after 4 o'clock the shorter road will open again. If I could do it again, I would do less time in Christchurch, more time in Wanaka. It is really expensive to stay there, but it's for a reason. It's so absolutely stunning, and there's a Mount Aspiring National Park there. There's also a very famous hike called Roy's Peak, which you've probably seen on Instagram. I really wanted to do this hike initially, but because we did the Ben Lomond track a couple days prior, we were just not in the right place to do another huge hike. But I have heard that doing a sunrise hike there is amazing. It was very windy in Wanaka, and we actually went into an Indian restaurant just to quickly find something to go to get out of the wind. And it ended up being the most amazing Indian food we've ever had. And we really like Indian food. Like, we go to a lot of Indian places. So if you want Indian food, there's a really good place in Wanaka, Bombay Palace. We were also staying next to a lake outside of Wanaka. We did do the secret sauna, which is not actually a secret, so I'm not giving anything away. But it's called the secret sauna, and you can rent for $20 per person a sauna experience with people. So you're in there with strangers. You can pay more, but it's pretty pricey. It's like $100 for a private one. And you hop between the sauna and the lake. So you do cold plunges in the lake and then hop back into the sauna. It was actually really cool to be with other people because we got to know some other travelers. Then we did our long 6-hour stretch of driving. So we went from Wanaka through the Mount Aspiring National Park for a little scenic viewing. And then we went all the way up the west coast, and we stopped through several really cool places that honestly we could have stayed in those areas, like the Fox Glacier. That's very famous. Being that we work on cruise ships, we've seen a lot of glaciers in Alaska and stuff, so that wasn't as important for us, but I know a lot of people really appreciate like glacial hikes and stuff, so that's one thing to consider. We stopped at Fantail Falls, eventually made our way to Greymouth, and we stopped at Pizza Hut and that was literally one of the only places to eat there. And then we went to our Airbnb and we watched the sunset. And then the next morning we drove a little bit farther, maybe like 1 or 2 hours, to Picton. And then we stayed in Picton for the night, and it was so relaxing. It was a little bit warmer up there, and we stayed by the bay in an Airbnb. It was just fantastic. And then we took the ferry back, finally took the ferry back to Wellington, and then we drove directly from Wellington to Lake Taupo. The first time I visited him in New Zealand, we did a whole trip around Lake Taupo because there's a lot of touristy things to do there if you're staying there in the North Island. But we just skipped all that because we already did so much. So we just went and viewed Hookah Falls from the top, and then we ate brunch and headed back to Auckland. It was an insane trip. Oh my god, we were like, did we actually just do that? Like, what just happened? But here are the top things that I would have done differently. Coming to New Zealand in late spring was nice because of the flowers blooming, but I definitely would plan for it to be a little bit warmer on the South Island. I would say January seems to be the best time to go. I would have planned a multi-day hike to really immerse myself in the nature. I would have planned to stay closer to the Fiordland National Park instead of Queenstown, because that is one of the top things to see on the South Island, and it actually might be worth seeing the Doubtful Sound instead of the Milford Sound because it's less touristy. And last but not least, I would have spent more time in Wanaka and less time in Christchurch. New Zealand is an absolutely amazing place to travel to. It's a top tourist destination for a reason, and planning your South Island itinerary can be quite a lot. It's good to plan far in advance with room to make adjustments, and make sure you budget for the expenses on this trip and figure out the most cost-effective way to make the trip. Trust me, it will be a trip of a lifetime. I love responding to comments, so if you have any questions, leave a comment below and I'll help you as best I can. If you found this video helpful and you enjoyed my footage of the South Island, hit that subscribe button and I'll see you in my next video. Have a great day, y'all!